Welcome to Women in B2B Marketing, a show where CMOs, VPs of marketing, and all strong women leaders in B2B discuss their top tactics, strategies, and tips for building high-performing teams, leveraging trends, and ultimately rocking their marketing careers. Made by and for women, insightful for all. I'm your host and 15-year B2B marketer, Jane Serra. Let's dive in. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Women in B2B Marketing. And today we have with us Ann Boyd, who's CMO at Stoplight, an avid yogi, I wish I was one too, and a former marketing professor, which we'll dive into. So thank you for joining us today, Ann.
Thanks for having me, Jane. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. I'm excited. We were already kind of geeking out over a couple things before we turned the mics on. And I'd love to dive into one that we were just chatting about, where you are CMO. And there's a lot of titles out there, and there's a new one. So we've heard Chief Growth Officer, Chief Revenue Officer, of course, Chief Marketing Officer. But you mentioned a new one that I think you just heard today.
Yeah, that's true. I just learned about Chief Market Officer. So, and the proponent of this name explains how we, in bringing marketing and really the go-to-market motion into the priority of the company strategically, thinking about how it's not a verb, it is a noun, it is an endeavor that gave it more heft, I guess, in dropping the ing. And so she really felt strongly about it. And it gave me a lot to think about, because I do think that especially as things are evolving, digital distribution, global, business as the norm, there's so many reasons why what we do is absolutely instrumental and center to the business. And I think it's great to think of ways to properly acknowledge that, whether or not it's the title name change or not.
It's true. And what are your thoughts? You mentioned when you first heard Chief Growth Officer that you loved that term, because it's like, yes, that's what we're focused on, growth. There's so much, beyond the initial branding that people, I guess, associate with marketing. And so I'm curious what you feel about, or I know I am struggling, but it's also because at first I'm averse to change and then I love it a minute later. But Chief Go-to-Market Officer has been talked about a lot, at least in the Rev Genius community. It's coming up a lot.
Right.
I think the struggle that I'm having with it is that it just doesn't flow. It's too wordy, and being in marketing, it's hard for us to have something that doesn't really make sense, right? Like linguistically, it just doesn't work. But curious your thoughts on that term.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I do get caught up in that as well, like what's easier to say. I do remember the first time I heard about growth and a whole marketing department being renamed Growth. And I thought, wow, that is really compelling, because, and it had to be like 7 years ago or more. And because it started to tell a story about what is happening, what the priority of the group was. And I think a different view of what I think has historically gotten associated with like the production of materials and pretty things, to the idea that is really the heart of it is growing the business, right? Why else would we do what we do? We are there to grow the business. My only hesitation now is that I think it's gotten over associated with demand gen and analytics, and that's the predominant motion. And so one of my big passions right now is to talk about how brand and demand work together, and that growth comes from the beauty of the yin and the yang. Like, it's not going to be one or the other that's going to make your business be successful and grow.
That's so true, because it's almost, even when I was just mentioning this to you, right? Chief Growth Officer, was it Chief? Yeah, that you like the Chief Growth Officer title because it kind of got away from what people thought marketing was, which was more branding or making things pretty. But it's funny because it's almost like we overcompensated and went into this extreme other end that's all focused on revenue and tracking and attribution right into a T. And we're now finding this, or need to find the balance between, I guess, brand and demand. Yeah, go into this more. Tell us your thoughts and how you achieve this.
I don't know why this is like a passion of mine from going way back. I studied anthropology, and there was always this trend. I'm not a great student of history, but of culture. And anywhere you look, you can see examples of people. It's just human nature, I guess, to go from one extreme to another and then kind of correct. And there's this constant swing. It's like a pendulum, like you said, or just this natural motion of a wave that people go through. And I think we absolutely overcorrected. And I think we're getting through that now. And there's some leaders in the space that for a few years now have been talking about how it's brand and demand. And I will mention LinkedIn as one of the sort of first major outlets that I feel like be a proponent of that with their customers, which I felt like was really great because they, there's a place where people are bringing their dollars and telling their story. And so, yeah, I think that it's so essential that people think about what is it that not only measuring the impact of your work, but what's the strategy behind it? And I've kind of, I think in my mind, brand was the overall value prop, right? Like, or the big vision for the company. So to me, it's not limited to this idea of a logo or, or brand mark. I feel like it's important to think about the context of the business and the measures of the actions and the connective tissue to the rest of the business, because that's really what's so exciting about now is that whole, how we can work together so closely. And we started to get into another thing of which is really exciting, like the revenue world, right? Chief revenue officer and then revenue operations, and being able as a marketer to tie in with people that are monitoring that part of the business so closely. And yes, demand gen and like some of the strategies and tactics from that world are essential to get to that effect. But then the brand strategy, needs to start the process ideally, or at least be a major component of how you're thinking about success.
I completely agree. And you can see sometimes it's clear and obvious, right? The story of brand and demand working together. Trying to think of examples like companies where like Mutiny, right? I've seen Mutiny take over the world the past couple of years. I see them everywhere. Chili Piper, right? Another one. You just see, that their brand presence has been invested in and it's working because they're just flourishing and growing. So I'm curious, and when I say brand presence, I don't mean to downplay all that goes into brand. There's so much that goes into that, but how can you, when you're not these big stories, right? How can you track and put value and measure to some degree the impact that your investment in brand is having?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I honestly, showing up at Stoplight, which was, and still is a small, relatively small API tool for API design. So we target developers and help them with the process of developing APIs, which are proliferating for business and all of digital transformation, right? Everybody's got to connect to something else. But in terms of the notoriety of the product and the name particularly, there was virtually zero. I came in at like 0.01% or something share of voice, which we look at, and that's one of the main like sort of initial tools that I look or measures that I look at, which is how sort of in aggregate, and there's different tools that you can use to get it, but how is your voice and your brand name coming through in the media at writ large, which includes often both now earned and social. So you have a sense of what's your penetration in people's minds, if you could, sort of get a glimpse at that. Obviously, it's not perfect, but it gives you a good sense, and especially relative to key competitors. And so typically I like to look right away, and, it's a blunt force, right? All these aggregated mentions and articles and social media and often like pickups of other, syndication or whatever. So I look at that and you start to see, do you have any notice? Now, beyond that, you've also got to look at like for your key audience, how are you perceived, right? And the brand, does the brand mean anything with the audience that you do have? So even if you don't register on the share of voice, for example, at Stoplight, I was then going to dig into what does the support group get in terms of comments and questions? What are the themes there? what are the other things I can do to assess? Because even, not having an NPS, a lot of companies, they're tiny, haven't been able to implement that. They might be too small to, right? You can't get to a statistical significant number, but you can get a sense and at least pull together that information and just determine how you're resonating. And I also went through actually I forget what they call them, a SaaS day, I think Gartner at one point, where, I really appreciated the depth of conversation that included how are stakeholders talking about the company? How do the executives talk to each other about the company? How do employees talk to each other? Does the idea of who we are mean something? And does it mean what we want it to mean? So it sounds kind of nebulous, but you can get a lot of like objective data in terms of volume and sentiment. And sentiment's always a little tricky, but at least have something to work with that compares you to others.
I love that. I have so many questions. I'm like jotting down as you chat. How long did it take you to drive that? I think you said like 0.01% share of voice, for example, at Stoplight when you first joined. Like to get that up, when did you start seeing some traction to bumping up that figure?
It's one of the things that I love about just marketing in general, but also I came from a communications background. You can see improvement really quickly when you start to just engage your audience, right? Like there's a certain amount of just volume of content that to deliver. And I will also caveat that there's overdoing it for sure. But when you're coming from like almost nothing, just developing some great basics of consistent posting and updating content can make a huge difference. It's not like you have to get a New York Times front page story right away, right? So I typically see improvements within the first couple of months, few months, really most, for sure, of impact. And then by the end of the first year, we were up to 2%, I believe, and we've been as high as 10%, and we're around 5 right now. It fluctuates vastly. So that's one of the things I learned being, growing up in communications and PR is that you cannot look at 1 month and really tell much of a story. So you have to look at like an aggregate over time and really track it. I really have found it does correlate with the anecdotal evidence too, where I'll hear from salespeople, wow, you guys are really punching above your weight. I've heard of, or an investor saying, yeah, somebody said that they, had heard of Stoplight and blah, blah, blah. And that stuff starts coming in and you're like, yes, that's exactly what we want.
Love that. Yes. Oh, that's amazing. I remember that with a previous company of mine, we had a prospect come to us and say, oh, I thought that you were too big for us. And I took that as such a win for marketing. That's what when you're talking about punching above your weight, like that was just a win. We ended up working with them. Anyway, we were not too big, but it was great that was the perception as we were trying to move upstream.
Absolutely. You want to look like that.
And so with the share of voice, this is fascinating for me, knowing that it can fluctuate. Because if you're talking to the founder, the CEO, right, and they want to see constant improvement, traffic going up and to the right, conversion rate slowly lifting, right, all of these metrics that you're tracking on a regular basis going up. So when you see this fluctuation, it's great to know and comforting, I'm sure, for many listeners, that there's going to be this range. So you want it to improve over time, but to accept that there's going to be a range that it fluctuates between.
Yeah, I think that that's like something that served me well in looking at all those other rates as well, because there's always going to be seasonality in business.
Yeah.
And there's going to be obviously signs that you need to pay attention to regarding the health of the business, and you can see those mount over time. But in my team, we look week to week. We do a pretty thorough assessment of the key metrics on a week to week basis. And so I wouldn't let things go like months, but you can definitely have an appreciation that there are these cycles. And when you talk to executives, and I've found that is incredibly helpful, because they do tend to, and by nature, they need to hone in on a key piece of critical information. They're going to try and find that one thing, and you need to help them understand, let's caveat this. We have 60 metrics that I track on a monthly basis, or actually weekly, and then report on monthly, that are indicators in altogether, right? But you can't just cherry pick. So trying to like bring that together in a comprehensive but not overwhelming way has been kind of the
Yeah.
biggest challenge that I've encountered, especially if you don't have a fancy tool that like sort of synthesizes and does the whole story for you, which I haven't. So
Yeah. Same.
yeah,
Same. Have to look through all the numbers, see which ones that need clarification and which are worth sharing, which are not.
right.
So interesting. And you mentioned so connecting brand and demand and how they go hand in hand. Wow, that was way too rhymey.
Yeah, I
But
know. Just happens.
but how these go together when you're talking about the consistency of posting and how you're able to see that 0.01 go to 10 eventually, and it lifted just within a couple of months' time. So seeing that, and now you got to the point where when your sales team is on calls, they hear, "Oh, we heard about you XYZ," or "You're punching above your weight." So those comments, it's working.
Mhm.
So what else is working? It seems like posting, I assume LinkedIn, but possibly elsewhere.
Mhm.
What do you see working generally? You don't have to give
Yeah,
specifics or your
totally.
secret sauce, but
I think one of the key points is, I mean, certainly there's a lot of different platforms. I mean, your website, most likely almost every business I would say today, that's your front door. So your owned media in that regard is like really a core focus. Beyond that, like you've got to look at where your audience is, right? So we take advantage of the major social media platforms just by volume. I mean, that's clearly something you want to pay attention to, just who's reaching the most people. And then beyond that, where the niche areas that your particular audience is hanging out and what are they consuming there, and how can you be a part of that conversation? And again, with limited resources, you have to be selective, right? LinkedIn, I do love, but it can be expensive, right? So then we look at other places. Maybe we're able to do more amplification on Facebook, and we're able to look at a place that's very particular to our users around Reddit and see some really positive results there. But there's a combination of organic and paid, right? You can't have one without
yeah.
the other. And I definitely have become convert in that regard, like earning your sort of news value or your brand value with what people used to talk about, the let's go viral. This is like, oh God, right? No one's going
Yeah.
to, by and large, no brand is going to cut through. And next thing you know, be on like front page or like on TV talking about their viral hit. Like that's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
But you can bring people into the conversation and you can boost like things to the right folks in the right context and amplify your message. And I just think that that's an essential part of the mix. So I would say looking for the right platforms that are, not only the largest, but also the fit for your audience, and then a combination of organic and boosted. And the other thing I would just add too, because I know it comes up a lot with marketers, is there's going to be some reliance. I think you had a guest recently who talked about this, like both the internal contributions to content and bringing in sourced content and balancing that out so that your team is not overstrained, your internal folks aren't, your SMEs or subject matter experts aren't strained, and you have some distribution of the spend from staff to vendors. So I like a little combo there.
So true. And then you can test out what works and bring someone back in if they were super successful. Yeah, testing out. And this kind of brings back, there's a term, you've been talking about this already, but I want, if you could kind of define in your own words, the term performance branding, which you mentioned to me, and I just love it. I've never heard that term before. So what is performance branding to you? And what have we already discussed that you would classify as that?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to pull up a definition that I stole from somebody else. So I'll give her credit. It's No Good Marketing online. But like, I loved the way they crystallized this, that performance branding is where creativity is rooted in data and performance is fueled by brand equity. So you get this, like, it's the flywheel, right? Like you can't have one without the other. And I think any good creative will tell you that and the studies show this, you need to start with something, right? Rarely do people just look at a white page and go, oh my God, I have the best idea, right? You're responding to something. So data is just this beautiful way to start with that creative process. And then the performance is going to build, and the data is going to be fueled by that resonance of the brand's message, right? Or the brand identity. You know, again, kind of the yin yang thing, like it's got to go hand in hand. I think more executives are starting to understand that. And I think, like you said, there's a pendulum swing. I have still found, you know, folks that are really just like, oh, well, I just need someone who can like get the pipeline filled, you know, and then convert at a high rate, right? Well, think about back in the day of SEO, right? We used to do all this rigging of technical like SEO optimization, but ultimately Google wisely and consumers, they vote by what's relevant, right? Like they pick what is actually meaningful. So if there's action without meaning, it's not useful. So that's kind of a long answer, but
no, that, I mean, the flywheel, that it makes perfect sense. And I love that definition. Did you say it was from No Good Marketing?
Yeah, No Good Marketing Agency 2021.
Cool. I can link to that in show notes if you.
Absolutely.
On the flip side of this, so these are all amazing examples of kind of what's working and how to get these two together and fueling each other. Is there anything that the past year or two you've seen just kind of die and that you're done with, and that is just not working anymore in this whole picture that of brand and demand working together?
That's really interesting. I love that question. And I don't think that there's any one thing. I would say, I guess one of the things that I'm still on the fence, I want to see more data on it. But I do remember at one point, you know, I could still get away with like or anyone, you know, you wanted to have a brand anthem video, like some beautifully produced, like big thing that told your like story. And I do think that in the day and age that we're in with TikTok and like Instagram stories and whatever, people kind of get a little cringy at like high production value, like softly muted, like offices and whatever. Like, I think that that's a little done. And I would say probably not worth the investment. I'm sure there's other examples where like beauty or hospitality, like different things where you're really creating this whole vibe might work. But for B2B, I think that it's probably run its course, at least, you know, or at least needs to be toned down quite a bit.
Yeah. Two things off of that. I wonder first if this is going to be another one of those pendulum things that comes back full circle, right? Where all of a sudden we're done with the raw, quick and dirty kind of video.
Yeah.
And we want really polished, beautiful things again. It'll be interesting and expensive if that comes back.
Well, the other thing that's kind of awesome though, and I worked in entertainment for a long time, is like the costs of production have really gone down with like the technology. So it's honestly, you know, what used to cost you $100,000 to make, you could probably do for $5 now, right? So that's an exciting opportunity, and I love video, so I'm not at all like opposed to that. I just think that there's a real sophistication in today's viewing audience, particularly like the bulk of the buying audience now is probably millennials, right? And leaders, and increasingly if you're targeting business leaders. And they have a little skepticism, right? Like they're not just going to buy some fancy video just for what it's worth. So I think that that's a part of it too.
Yeah, so true. Speaking of videos too, and this content really of all different levels, because I've seen the unpolished and the polished of this, but I've seen more companies creating the media leg, right, of their brand. And the marketing team has to become a media company, that whole thing. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that? Do you agree? And to what extent?
Yeah, so I got first exposed to that whole phenomenon actually when I was at Sony Pictures back in like early 2000s, or, you know, first decade at least of the 2000s. And I had the pleasure of meeting a guy who had kind of pioneered that stuff with, and Beth Comstock at GE and Alex Jutkovitz, who has written a book about it, and I'm blanking on the name right now. But in any case, they were really the first to sort of, or at least, you know, they got noticed for this idea of creating a content hub that was targeting your user or your audience in a way that replicated some kind of a content, like a media play, but telling a more objective or more broader story. And I think, and designed to build credibility and authority and loyalty. And I think that it's done a lot of those things. I think it's really an essential part, as we talked about before, like the owned piece of your media. I believe it's not just about like product list and features and leadership, right? You've got to have a position. So thought leadership is really important in that realm. I don't think you necessarily have to create a separate site or like sort of try and keep something in the umbrella of some kind of like adjacent but not directly under you sort of entity. But I think that bringing the thought leadership is important. And then I think that the thing I would just also, mention, and I think is a challenging one for a lot of companies is, when you're small and you're trying to be scrappy and get content together, there can be this phenomenon of just sort of taking some maybe questionable stuff and putting it out there. And I do think we are going to have to be increasingly conscientious of the quality, and because consumers are already getting fatigued, and I hear increasingly people that don't even, consume news articles anymore because they're just like, too much, and they're just going to like watch their For You or whatever. Yeah. And I think that there's a danger in flooding the market with things that aren't necessarily helpful. Although the second caveat to that is that AI needs to be fed with information that is accurate or that keeps your brand in the dialogue. And so there is, I think, going to be a little bit of a race on volume, but I hope that with it, we also prioritize accuracy.
I've heard that a lot recently, that there's, because of this volume increase in content production and AI and everything, right, and the quick and dirty not needing to be published, that now there's this circle back to needing to focus on quality and make sure that it's not just turning out and not paying attention to those details. So that makes perfect sense. There's one other thing, and I realized I did not get to dive into your career, so I do want to do that right after we touch on this, because you mentioned a couple of previous company names. I was like, we need to dive into that. So we'll get to that next. But first, another sort of term that you may have coined this term, but maybe you keep me honest, is the conference effect. I saw you mention this on LinkedIn and after attending a conference recently. So curious if you could tell our audience about that.
Absolutely. I'd love to. So this actually is something I learned from Julia Boorstin, who is an incredible woman executive. She's been at CNBC for years, business reporter, just phenomenal. And she just wrote a book called When Women Lead. And so I was at this Women in Tech conference and she was a guest and she was talking about this. She's honed in on kind of these 5 different traits. Don't ask me to repeat them all because I really won't remember. But anyway, one of them was that she honed in on these things that give women some sort of like extra ability and like where are their strengths as leaders. And one of the things was about community and the ability to build community, the ability to navigate and like really master a community for their own benefit, but also for the benefit of others. And so I loved that idea. And she had one stat, and I have to read for the whole thing. So I'll try and find it after we talk. But there was a stat that literally when women go to conferences, they are actually more likely to get a raise and promotion after. So there was literally this halo effect in business of women. And I don't know if men were studied too, so I should like say that. But like for women, they experience this benefit, a tangible benefit. And I had a thought about that coming out of this event, and she referred to it as the conference effect, really referring more to this like increase in acknowledgement and actual earning potential. And for me, I really started to think about how, I've always been drawn to those types of activities. I rely on my network for, ideas, sanity, of course, jobs when you're looking or hiring when you're hiring, and just creative ideas and keeping up. I mean, it's so important to me. And I feel like every time I go to an event, I get inspired about something else. And so the takeaway for me was like, when you lean into your career and you lean into whatever it is you're doing, you're going to seek out things to add to the mix of what you do, regardless of whatever it is, right? And it doesn't have to be like that particular conference or that particular class, but just something that enriches your experience of the role and your ideation in that field. And so I think, and then also, very importantly, the literal connections that may turn into the next job, the next client, the next deal, the next key employee, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. This is fascinating to me because it makes me think, well, a couple things again. I'm going to GTM 2023 Pavilions event in a couple of weeks. So yay.
Right.
Good timing. But it brings me back. I had a conversation on the show. One episode was with Jen Capstraw, who's an email guru. Highly recommend you follow her, and everybody does. But she spoke about something very similar where when she was down and out in between jobs, she decided she was going to invest in herself and go to this event. And she just is a big advocate of spend the money on yourself, even when you don't have it. Invest on yourself because it gives you the confidence. You learn while you're there. You build this community when you're at the event. And now this kind of comes full circle because you're saying that I need to read this book. The impact is actually an increase in earning potential too. So it actually is a legitimate investment that brings return.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that hopefully more companies are supporting that as well. I always think it's so great when companies are able to encourage their employees to get some additional experience and exposure out there. So even if you can't do it yourself and you are looking for your work to sponsor it, maybe bring up the potential benefits in terms of your engagement, connection, knowledge, all the things that you're going to bring to the table afterwards.
So true. Just you getting out there, building that community brings exposure for whatever company you're with at that time. So it helps them exponentially too. I love this. If you can give me the name of the book after, I'll be sure to link to that in show notes too. This will be a good one for everyone. We're all about community here. So.
Absolutely. And Julia's amazing. So she definitely recommends following her too.
Thank you. And then to go back to the beginning, I'm curious. So you've mentioned a really interesting journey and career path so far and a couple little blips. Can you walk us through how you came to being in B2B marketing and the fun journey you took to get here?
Yeah, it was funny. I reflected on that question because it's really to be specifically in B2B marketing that I think a lot of people today think of like SaaS or whatever. That really didn't happen for me until 2017, 18, right? I mean, I was doing a little bit of it. But what I think really for me, I came out of college and I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought maybe go back to grad school and and become a teacher or, professor. But I fell into tech because I just started meeting people that were so incredible. And I had a chance to do a startup. And I think what happened for me is I saw really from the tiny, initiation of a business, the crystal of an idea, how all the parts of the business and all the roles work together to build it. And so I think the key finding for me was thinking about business first and how businesses function was always really central to my approach. And even though I ended up going through and, I got into PR, I worked on Microsoft Business at Wagner Edstrom for a while, which is now We, and learned some of the best practices as relates to product marketing and public relations and analyst relations and all these things, which was incredible. And then moved into entertainment for a long time. And, you might think that was more B2C, but honestly, I was typically dealing with the corporate side, our reputation in the investment community, in the music industry, and entertainment industry, lawsuits, all the nitty gritty. And I still really love that part. And so, as it evolved and nowadays where, I think, everyone's kind of, focused on that SaaS or the shift from enterprise to, new ways of doing business positioned me well to have a little bit of that experience.
Yeah.
And now I sort of think more about it, but historically it's just kind of been, okay, well, yeah, business and then reaching other businesses really came naturally as part of it because I understand how they work and what they need. And there's some tactics to reach them effectively.
Amazing. And it's fascinating. You're right. When you said Sony, right? If
Yeah.
corrects me if I'm wrong. So I hear that and I do think B2C, but it's interesting because with every, especially big companies, but with every company, there's so many layers and everything is so different to how things are structured. There's just so many positions that you wouldn't even know exist.
Is it?
So it's interesting to hear the B2B side of things there
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
I'm curious throughout this career path, could you walk us through? And if you don't have one, I won't put you on the spot too much, but let me know if you could walk us through one of your biggest hurdles, any point in your career and how you got through it.
Oh man. I mean, the honest answer is really like my own burnout.
Yeah.
I reached a point where I had given all that I have to give emotionally, and it turns out the lesson was like, you can't get that invested.
Yeah.
And so I also realized that I think the other big part of that too was bringing my voice to the table confidently. And at times, like, needs to be unfiltered, right? You need to not feel like you have to like I had a pattern of or at least a tendency towards like pleasing or
Mm.
diplomacy with authority, right? And then that doesn't really serve you when you have to help shape results. And if you have a strong feeling, and that's part of what I learned, like trust your gut. And if your gut, like
Yeah.
that means like both if you need to take a break because you're burnt out or that day you're just tired or your lack of creative juices or you feel like you're going to be short with the person on your team because you've lost your patience,
Yeah.
step back, right? Like no one's gonna, I mean, or at least hopefully not like hold you in your chair or
Yeah.
whatever to have that conversation right then. And likewise, like if you see something that is wrong or could be done better or whatever it is, speak your mind, right? Leaders want
Yeah.
to hear that. They want and that's really been the outcome for me is not only more sanity in my career, my day to day, and like more time with my family, which, I didn't, I barely see my kids when they were tiny, and more sanity there, more pleasure, more happiness, and more impact. I have CEOs that say, oh my God, thank you. Like, no one's telling us that, or what, how
Yeah.
can you help me figure this out? And you become a more strategic partner because you're not holding.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's also stepping out of your lane a bit? Like because if you're giving that candid feedback or you notice something that's not necessarily under marketing's umbrella, right? Being able to feel confident speaking to that in an appropriate manner too.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good point and nuance of things. And I think my hope is, and I try to employ like a peer, sort of engagement strategy before there's some kind of like hell, right? Like I think that
Yeah.
there's nothing good to come from blame, right? And like I've seen so many companies waste so much time and energy trying to point fingers. And the reality
Yes.
is all of us have just got to work together. And so anyway, I would just be careful about like, yes, if you see things like bring it to the person who is in charge, who can make a difference first. And then, I mean, if you really hit a wall or if it's something that's much bigger or even the CEO's direct responsibility, then of course, like go there. But I think always be a good colleague first.
Yes. So true. It's you're brought up hopefully, right? Saying be a good person and you want to be a good person. Kind of extending that. I love the term be a good colleague,
This
right?
is,
Because you always want to help each other out. You're not trying to, or we shouldn't be trying to throw somebody under the bus or point fingers. Definitely no blame game. That doesn't help anybody. It just keeps everyone down. So if you have good intentions, sometimes they don't always pan out, but if you have good intentions and you're trying to help, if you go directly to that person who's owning a piece and you bring it to light in a positive manner and hope that they would do the same for you, right?
Right.
They notice something on the marketing world that, I mean, we always get ideas from everybody, right? Like, I
Yeah.
have a great marketing idea. But yeah, you want that mutual respect for everyone on your team.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of goes back to the quote that I found for the, and the conference effect. Like I sort of felt like this curiosity and reciprocity really summarized the key like benefits of your network. And that means your network in the company and out. Like come to things with a curious mind and a disposition towards generosity, right? How can you help each other?
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you. This is amazing. I'm curious as one kind of quick sign off. Let's see, which one should we go to? I think what is a tip that you have either for your younger self just starting out or for a fellow listener, another marketer in B2B marketing?
Ugh. I mean, I think it's really like, don't let go of your curiosity, right? Like be curious
Yeah,
because as it's easier when you're younger, maybe because you feel like, okay, I don't know things, but stay curious,
yeah,
right? Like it's going to help you
yeah,
do everything better. And it's not just at work. It's like all the things in life that then contribute to who the self you bring to work and the success of your business.
yes. Stay curious. There's always so much more to learn, especially in marketing where it changes every day, it
Yeah.
seems. So,
Right? Can you imagine if you
okay.
weren't and like all these changes pummeling you every day?
I know. I mean, that's what I love. One thing I love about marketing is that it's never the same, right?
Yep.
It's never from day to day. Your agenda and what you're focused on is always changing. It's never boring. Well, thank you, Anne, so much. This has
Thank
been
you.
so enlightening. I definitely have a couple things to read and look up afterwards to dive more into because I love so much about this, the conference effect and performance branding.
Cool.
So for anybody who wants to follow up and connect with you, where's the best place to reach you?
LinkedIn is great.
Perfect. I'll put your LinkedIn in show notes,
Yeah.
but Anne
Yeah.
Boyd, you can search
And
her.
JD, I think, is on LinkedIn. But in any case, yeah.
Oh, okay, got it, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll link. So thank you for joining us and thank you everybody for listening. We'll see you
Yeah.
next time.
Take care. Thank you.